Welcome to the IISS America's office in Washington, D.C. We're very glad to have you here to celebrate the launch of a new Adelphi series book by Joshua Rovner. This book was published last month, I think mid-January. A lot has changed in the last 4 weeks, but Josh is here to guide us through with his structures in terms of strategy and grand strategy. So Joshua is an associate professor of foreign policy and global security at the American University School of International Service, having had previous appointments at SMU and the U.S. Naval War College. He is the author or co-editor of 5 books, and in addition to his many articles and book chapters, he writes regularly for War on the Rocks. So we have the book here. It's titled Strategy and Grand Strategy. In some sense, I'm serving as a sort of fill-in for the series editor, Dr. Benjamin Rode, who is based in London. But in terms of Joshua's book, which I think makes an important contribution to the scholarly and policy debate over these contested terms, we have some kind of advanced praise for the book. Hal Brands has said that Joshua Rovner is one of the most creative strategic studies scholars of his generation. Anyone interested in the theory and practice of strategy and grand strategy should read his new book. So on that, we agree. Now, Joshua will give us a brief overview of his book and its main lines of argument, and then we'll have reactions and commentary from our 2 distinguished panelists. So we have Kori Schake, who is Senior Fellow and the Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. Previously, she was Deputy Director General of the IISS in London. She's had a distinguished career in government and is author of 5 books, most recently, America versus the West. Can the liberal world order be preserved? It's a good week for that question. And we also have Stephen Feldstein, who is Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, focusing on technology and geopolitics and U.S. foreign policy. He previously served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State during the Obama administration, worked at USAID, and as counsel on the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. And in 2021, he published The Rise of Digital Repression, How Technology is Reshaping Power, Politics, and Resistance. So in terms of housekeeping, we have a live audience, but we're also on Zoom. For those of you in the Zoom audience, welcome. To participate in the discussion later on and to ask a question, please use the Q&A function on Zoom. So open the Q&A window, type your question, and I'll be able to see it on the iPad. This event will be on the record, and a recording will be available probably within about 48 hours on the IISS.org website. We're also offering copies of Joshua's book for sale here in the back afterwards. And there's also an opportunity to purchase the book at a 20% off rate for those of you online from Routledge or, from Amazon. So without further ado, I'll pass the mic over to Joshua, and he can give us an overview of the main lines of the book, and we'll join the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Paul. Thanks to IISS for hosting, especially Lee and Caitlin for organizing this event. Thanks to Kori and Steve for reading the book and commenting on the book. It's brand new, and I can't think of any 2 smarter people to give their 2 cents on it. No, they're marvelous, and I'm thrilled that they're here. Most importantly, thank y'all for coming out. It is not warm out there. It is somewhere between 0 and 20 degrees, and so the fact that you've braved the cold means a lot. So I do appreciate that. I should say I'm delighted to have written this book, and I'm delighted to have written an Adelphi for the Adelphi series. I'm sure you know this already, but this series has an extraordinary history. It goes all the way back to 1961, and the roster of authors in the Adelphi series is just the who's who of strategy and international relations in the Cold War and after. I mean, you have everybody from Bernard Brodie and Thomas Schelling, Lawrence Friedman, more recently people like Audrey Kurth-Cronin and Frank Gavin. And these authors have written for the series, and what they have in common, despite their differences and their different views on things, is that they both write, or they all write in a way which takes current events but looks for deeper themes and sort of enduring forces in politics and strategy, which helps us understand current dilemmas, right? These are not just things that they dash off. They're not sort of policy pieces that they dash off. They try for something more profound. And in so doing, they often make comments which resonate long after the fact. So this morning, just for fun, I went and looked again at the very first Adelphi paper written by Alistair Buchan, the founding director of the Institute. And it's about NATO, right? It's about the evolution of NATO. And in the paper, he writes with considerable chagrin that Americans seem tone deaf about the views of their NATO allies. This was 1961. He was writing this. And I'm thinking, okay, that might sound a little familiar. So all of these authors try to look for deeper themes, and they're all deeply, deeply involved in both strategic theory, but also in history. In the spirit of that tradition, I've tried to approach the subjects of strategy and grand strategy in a way that explain well-known events, but also maybe say something about the present. And my starting point is just to take these two big words, right, and try to explain what they mean. Strategy, it's a theory of victory. Strategy tells you how to win a war. It's a theory of how you use military force in the pursuit of some political goal. Grand strategy is a theory of security. Grand strategy is a story about how you keep yourself safe in a frequently unsafe world, how you use various instruments of national power in order to survive and thrive in the world, right? So the terms are related, strategy and grand strategy, but they are different, and the differences matter. And one of the main themes in the book is that there are big consequences for confusing one with the other. If you think that you are securing yourself long-term because your strategic decisions in war are going well, you might be surprised in the aftermath. And some of the case studies explore countries who fight quite well in war, but end up undermining their grand strategy as a result. Right? So strategy and grand strategy are not the same, and there's a real danger in confusing one for the other. There are several other themes in the book that I try to bring out in case studies, right? One is that strategic blunders can undermine what's otherwise a very good grand strategy, right? You can have a very coherent and sustainable theory of your own security, and you can blow it all in wartime through making bad choices about military action, right? For this reason, among others, civilian political officials need to get smart on war. This is not something that they can leave to the generals. This is not something that they can overlook. And the case that I use to illustrate this idea is the Peloponnesian War, Athens versus Sparta, right? 5th century BC. Very old war. A million people have written a million books about this war. What could I possibly say which is new about this war? Well, I think I can. I think that thinking in terms of strategy and grand strategy gives us an important perspective on the war because, as I argue in the book, both Athens and Sparta had really good grand strategies. Both of them had theories of their own security, and they should have sustained themselves. Athens, the great naval power with a great naval trading empire, and Sparta, the great land power, who was inherently conservative, small c conservative. It didn't want to expand. It didn't want to stretch out too far, right? So both of them should have had sustainable peace and prosperity for a long time, but they both went to war and they fought under considerable delusions about how they should fight and win. These delusions ended up ruining them both, right, after a very costly, protracted 30-year war, right? So strategic blunders can undermine your grand strategy. A second theme, strategy and grand strategy sometimes work at cross purposes. Right? Sometimes having a good strategy can undermine you in the long term. Right? Sometimes having a bad strategy is the best thing that can happen. So, to illustrate this idea, I looked at the American War of Independence, something that Corey knows very well, right? France versus Great Britain in the United States, or the colonies at the time, right? Both France and Great Britain had problematic grand strategies before the war. They were inconsistent. In some ways, they were self-contradictory, right? In the war, France fought brilliantly. French strategy was exceptionally good, both in terms of its military operations and its wartime diplomacy. British strategy was a dismal failure. British strategy in the war was very problematic for a lot of reasons, right? So France wins, Britain loses, France has a party, Britain has some serious soul searching after it loses shockingly. But the effects on grand strategy are opposite, right? For France, its grand strategy comes under deep pressure because it spends so much in the war on behalf of the American colonist. And this contributes to the fall of the monarchy not long after. For Britain, it fights terribly, it loses shockingly, but the long-term effect of this loss is very healthy because it forces British officials to have a hard conversation about the real sources of their national security. Not patrolling a vast territory in North America, but patrolling the seas and reinvesting in the Navy and developing a grand strategy of naval imperialism. So sometimes, as I put in the book, history is written by the losers. A third theme in the book, uncertain grand strategies can lead to half-hearted and hedging wartime decisions. And I use the Vietnam War as an explanation about how this can take place. There's been, again, many, many books written on US military strategy and Vietnam, but they haven't quite approached it in the way that I approach it. And the reasons why the military experience was so frustrating to the United States, I think the fundamental issue is that US grand strategy was uncertain. This is during the weird period between the Cuban Missile Crisis and détente, that weird decade where American leaders wanted to contain the Soviet Union, but were desperately eager to avoid another crisis, right? They hadn't quite gotten to rapprochement, but they didn't want to fight too hard. What that meant was that American leaders were committed to containment in Vietnam, but they didn't want to be too provocative. And we all know the outcome. A fourth theme of the book is that some policies make sense at one level, but make little sense at another. Take, for instance, nuclear weapons, right? The idea of nuclear strategy is logically absurd. You cannot fight and win a nuclear war. This was at least the idea, made famous by Bernard Brodie, right? That the consequences of a nuclear exchange were so devastating that they would overwhelm any conceivable political goal in a war. And if you can't calibrate your means and ends in wartime, then you can't, by definition, have strategy. So why do we invest so much money and effort in the nuclear complex? Why has the United States spent so much money on these weapons over the course of many decades? The answer is that I think it makes sense in terms of grand strategy. Right? The United States gets a lot from its nuclear complex, even if it can't conceptualize actually winning a war with nuclear weapons. So again, some things that don't make sense in terms of strategy end up making some sense at the level of grand strategy. And the fifth theme that I'll close with has to do with modernity. I want to come all the way up to the present and think about the influence of emerging technologies on strategy and grand strategy. We spend a lot of our days now talking about artificial intelligence or cybersecurity or other new tech and how that might change future war and future national security decision making. At some level, I think that it will change how we think about war fighting. But at the same time, I suspect we're going to see a similar pattern with these new technologies as we have in the past. Whenever new technologies, radical new technologies come on the scene, there's a pattern which happens. The first thing that happens is hope. Strategists hope that by mastering new technologies, they can win wars very quickly and secure the nation very cheaply. Right? We saw this happen with the rise of naval warships in the 16th century. We saw it with the rise of strategic bombing later on. Right? There's this initial burst of enthusiasm. This is the wonder weapon that will not help us win quickly and secure ourselves in the long term. Right? But the next thing that happens is fear. And the fear is, what if somebody else gets there first? What if somebody else masters this new technology before we do? We will be desperately at risk in war and desperately insecure in peacetime. But after a while, people figure out that implementing these technologies is really hard. Right? It turns out that it's really hard to organize a naval battle, and it's really hard to organize a bomber fleet effectively. And I suspect we're going to learn that it's really hard to fight with cyber tools and with AI tools. And at a certain point, a kind of resignation sets in, right? And people realize that there's value in new technologies, but they don't fundamentally change the relationship between war and politics, right? So in terms of current technologies, emerging technologies like AI, we certainly are experiencing the hope and fear. Right? We are hopeful about the prospects for these tools. We're desperately afraid that others will get there first. We haven't quite reached that point of resignation. Right? I hope that at some point we do. I hope that we don't enter into war or enter into a conflict with unrealistic expectations of what these technologies will provide. Because if we do, I think it will be a very painful learning experience. So I will stop there and hand it over to my illustrious colleagues.
So I confess I was dreading reading this book. And I only, because I think there's so much dumb commentary on strategy, right? And to use the term strategic has become another way of saying, no, really, this is important. And so I strike it out of everything I see it in. And I only agreed to read it because I am such a longtime fan of Joshua Rovner and his body of work. And I was out so rewarded because this is a fabulous book. It's smart, it's serious, it's not pedantic about strategy. It's rigorous in applying the strategies to historical cases. I just thought it was wonderful. Buy it, read it, talk about it. It's a great book. So well done, Joshua. I thought that the way he approached it with the theory, which you breeze through really nicely, like you didn't bog down on a lot of the ways that most people who write about strategy bog down. I loved the chapter on the Peloponnesian War. I think I would have, so it all by itself refutes Graham Allison's terrible book about the Thucydides trap. And what comes through for me so clearly in your discussion is that they both Athens and Sparta had grand strategies, which worked in peacetime and didn't work when they were each other's adversaries. What I saw, and I thought you could draw out even more, is they actually have to swap queens. Athens has to learn to fight a land war, and Sparta has to learn to fight on the ocean. And so their grand strategy remains, but in both cases, it's executed by reversing the strategy that they came into the war with. I thought that was a really smart point that you make, that ought to have been made by everybody, including Thucydides. The very best chapter in the book is the chapter on French support for the American Revolution. It's just terrific. It builds on the scholarship of Brendan Sims, another great book, Three Victories and a Defeat, about the way that the British loss of North America, the American colonies of North America, that frees Britain up for what becomes the ascent to hegemonic power. I would have loved to see you extend the aperture of that to the collapse of it, because I think at least one useful theory of why British hegemony gets overtaken is the advance of railroads. Like Britain could dominate the world by dominating the seas because there wasn't reliable land travel. And once you get reliable land travel, all of a sudden they don't have choke points anymore. So their confidence in the success of their strategy actually becomes a strategic vulnerability, which is an argument you make in other places in the book, and I thought applied there as well. One other thing that really struck me in the American Revolution chapter is how much Britain's offshore balancing strategy ultimately relies on having partners that can bear the weight. And that's where I think I made the connection to your argument about Vietnam, because I wasn't persuaded about the Vietnam case study, because it seems to me that the challenge was we had a strategy that fundamentally relied on the legitimacy and capability of the South Vietnamese government, and they were not a partner that could bear the weight of our strategy. Whereas Britain, especially during the Napoleonic Wars, they didn't have a single partner, but they were brilliant at aggregating the Spanish, the Portuguese, the 137 German principalities into a reliable force. And I think in general, that's an interesting line, maybe for you to explore on something else on the applications of offshore balancing. The last thing, I loved where you closed the book on comparing artificial intelligence and the gee-whiz technologies, and the way that you say they are prejudicing us to think about warfare as short and sharp. And it took me back to the Eisenhower administration, which is I also wasn't entirely persuaded by your argument about nuclear weapons being great grand strategy, but not strategy. Because the Eisenhower administration was quite serious about broken back warfare. That is the war that happens after the nuclear exchange. And I think you make that case for artificial intelligence, and I'd be interested in whether you think it can apply to how you were thinking about nuclear weapons' role in strategy and grand strategy. But those are small, tiny, marginal, me trying to keep pace with your thinking in a genuinely magnificent book.
Great. Well, let me first of all echo what Corey said in terms of praise and my delight in reading Josh's book. I have taught and done, as you mentioned, way too much reading about strategy and grand strategy and statecraft. And I also was curious as to whether I would be presented with something interesting, novel, and original. And I was delighted to see that I was. I think that Joshua lays out a very clear argument. It's supported by lively and engaging case studies, as Corey has walked through a few of them. They're illustrated in a concise and analytic manner, and really, I think, displays well the interplay between strategy and grand strategy over the decades. His lessons, whether probing Athens and Sparta's rivalry, or looking at the consequences of France's intervention in the American War of Independence, or examining grand strategy in the Cold War are enlightening, insightful, and also fun to read. As we dive headlong into a moment of grand strategic ambiguity, where America's theory of security is undergoing rapid change at the behest of our current president, I think it would be wise for policymakers to pay heed to the lessons Joshua lays out in the book, although I fear this is unlikely to happen. In the few minutes I have, I want to highlight a few things that struck me that perhaps will be fodder for further conversation and response. So one place to turn to, and it's actually nice that Corey kind of looked at some of the historical case studies. I'm going to focus a little more on the kind of contemporary ones, but one of them I wanted to highlight was Chapter 4, which is strategy, grand strategy after 9/11. And I thought that was particularly fascinating, the way you kind of laid out the contradictions between a counterterrorism strategy of victory and grand strategy goals. And I think you really do a good job of explaining how America's interminable engagement in Iraq and then Afghanistan made sense from a grand strategy perspective, even though the U.S. Got further and further away from a theory of strategic victory. Over time, it would appear that the grand strategy rationale for remaining in Afghanistan or pursuing post 9/11 counterterrorism operations were diminishing. And you note that critics increasingly mention trade-offs. So dedicating more resources to China or Russia, or focusing more attention on those rivals. So one question I have would be, what confluence of events, whether for the post 9/11 era or another era, is sufficient to cause a big redirection of grand strategy? So you write in the book that, quote, the purpose of grand strategy is security, a subjective condition informed by psychology and politics as much as the objective balance of power. And I would be curious to hear you push that analysis a little further. Are there subjective conditions that ripen sufficiently? Is there a pattern that convinces leaders to shift course? I would be curious to hear you expand on this aspect. A second question I would also be curious to hear your perspective on would be the biases of particular actors, the Pentagon, National Security Council, State Department, and others when it came to pushing different conceptions of grand strategy. So for Afghanistan, the Pentagon was committed to staying the course. Why was that? Is the Pentagon naturally biased to prioritize strategic victory over grand strategy considerations? Is this due to its operational structure? Is this always the case? And is the role of OSD policy to provide balance between the tactical operational considerations and higher level security goals? And if the Pentagon is unable to accomplish this balance, does this point to a deficiency in its constitution? Moving to Chapter 5, I was struck from the beginning. I think you talk about the U.S. Continuing to pursue a strategy of the status quo and China pursuing a grand strategy of revision. And I was struck just in the last 48 hours whether we're starting to see a reversal of those positions, particularly the head-spinning shift in relations taking place in Saudi currently between the U.S. and Russia. On Chapter 5, there's a large focus that you have on cyber war and its effect on grand strategy. And one aspect I'm starting to detect, in part it's due to the implications of the Ukraine war, is that I do wonder if the implications or the preoccupation on cyber war is diminishing, and that it's being replaced almost simultaneously, as you discuss a bit about with AI hype and threat inflation. And so, I would sort of ask, as you look at the cyber analysis in the book, and while you certainly do touch upon AI, but there are already sort of subsequent conversations taking place when it comes to accomplishing AGI and the decisive strategic advantage that presumably great powers will accomplish if they attain that technological goal. By the end of the Biden administration, which feels like ages ago, the AI arms race had become the primary strategic justification for a wide-ranging level of export controls. And one of the few areas of continuity for now under Trump has been maintaining a U.S. lead on the AI arms race vis-a-vis China. So any thoughts about how this dynamic fits into the grand strategy framework? Is it a game changer when it comes to this technology, or how does it fit within the theoretical framework that you've mentioned? Lastly, I would sort of point out, you mentioned in the conclusion, and we talked a little bit about this, that the Ukraine-Russia war presents sort of an interesting conundrum, and one where you might see shifting conceptions of strategy and victory and grand strategy sort of transition over time. And I'm curious whether you would expand further about the grand strategic implications of Russia's war in Ukraine, particularly as we may be approaching a ceasefire or endgame in that conflict. I think the consensus thus far has been that Russia's intervention, Russia's war, has been a strategic blunder. But in recent months, we can see arguments about why Russia may accrue more benefits than thought. And with concessions by Trump and the possibility of renewed relations with the U.S., not to mention the larger undermining of Western cohesion, is that theory also one that is subject to revision? So, I think in general that not only have you presented an interesting framework and one that gives us a lot to think about when it comes to the case studies that you presented, but is one that I think is a working theory that is applicable and has caused me to think carefully about its implications when it comes to new technological developments with regard to AI, as well as new rivalries that the United States and other great powers are grappling with in a rapidly changing world. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Stephen, Corey, and Josh. You guys have pulled on some important threads, and I think there's enough there to kind of keep us going for 2 hours. But before I go back to Josh to see if you have any responses to the comments, I'll just note that for those participating online, this would be a good time to begin populating the question box with any queries that you may have. But Josh, let's turn it over to you in case you have any responses to Corey and to Stephen.
Just to say thank you. These are excellent questions. I'm not at all surprised that that you've read it so carefully and there's such incisive questions, and it's good that we disagree on some of the interpretations. I'm not going to go into deep response because I do want to open it to the floor. I'll just say a couple of things on these comments and how we understand maybe more recent events, because you both touched on AI, and that in particular I think needs some discussion. So in terms of artificial intelligence and what general effects that I think that we should watch for, I would say that artificial intelligence does have the flavor of the nuclear revolution, in the assumption that a war among modern, technologically sophisticated states who know how to exploit artificial intelligence will be over very quickly. That this will be a battle of who can decide the fastest, who can use their tools with the greatest precision and have a decisive victory. Indeed, AI suggests speed, right? In all applications, that it suggests the ability not only to understand what's going on very quickly, but to act against the enemy very, very quickly. So there's an enormous what's called a first mover advantage. Right? I'm sorry, I'm bringing in theory now, but this is the idea. And we heard very similar arguments about nuclear weapons, that there was a first mover advantage and that you don't want to be caught out. And indeed, General then President Eisenhower thought very hard about preemption, right? As well as the possibility of the day after, right? But I think that what we're going to learn, and this is to draw out the nuclear comparison again, was that operationalizing nuclear weapons in combat proved really, really tricky. Even at the conceptual level, and the Army in the 50s experimented with all kinds of novel concepts. The Pentomic Division comes to mind. But actually thinking through what a nuclear war would look like, it rested on a series of increasingly difficult assumptions about how you would operate the day after. And in terms of nuclear decision making, when presidents were ultimately faced with the choice of would I actually do this, they backed away. There was some sort of special fear of nuclear weapons that they couldn't wrap their heads around. I think what's similar in terms of AI, the emotional aspect is not quite the same. We use AI already in combat. This is sort of built into modern operations. But what is similar is that really making use of AI requires organizations to behave well together. This is not simply a matter of getting the software right or getting the best model. Any war is a clash of armed bureaucracies, right? And the bureaucracy needs to work efficiently in order to execute and make best use of these new technologies. It's going to be really hard to do. Right. I think we see that to some extent in the struggles about how to operationalize nuclear weapons in the Cold War. And I'm sure we're going to see that as people try to conceptualize the use of AI in a great power war today or in the future. That kind of touches on both your questions. So why don't we stop there and maybe open it up for questions?
Thanks, Josh. I may just launch us into the discussion and question period with one sort of framing question, which, which looks at the aperture of the framework that you've sketched in the book. So you describe strategy as a theory of victory, grand strategy as a theory of security. But to what extent does this framework rely on us thinking about strategy and grand strategy in war versus at all times? If you think about the period since at least the end of the Second World War, most of the time, the great powers have not been at war, they've been at peace, and yet still doing strategy in some sense, but actually more particularly grand strategy in order to seek perhaps advantage in some way or another, which ultimately perhaps relates to security in the long term. But a lot of the activity that you see, in terms of what Trump might be doing in the U.S., it's or other countries are doing, they're seeking a strategic advantage in some way, but it may be slightly divorced from the idea of seeking victory, seeking security. So how do we think about the kind of the aperture? Is it more applicable to the times when countries are seeking sort of economic advantage in technologies, which, at least in the first instance, the competition's playing out in the commercial and the private sector, not at war? Thanks.
That's a big question. And as a way of approaching the issue, I think it helps to think of this question in terms of the time between episodes of war, right? And the way that states think about grand strategy and strategy can change the longer you get from the end of the last conflict. So when in the immediate aftermath of a conflict, states might be intensely concerned with their grand strategy, right? Especially if they lose. Like, oh my goodness, our attempt at strategy in the last war failed. This has left us vulnerable in the aftermath because it has exposed our military weaknesses. So in the immediate aftermath of such an event, people have a tendency to not necessarily panic, but there's a sense of urgency in how they're thinking of national security at those moments. But time heals. The immediate urgency in a post-war environment kind of attenuates over time, and people start thinking about other issues that you mentioned, like economic prosperity and social goods that we try to achieve, right? And in that sense, what we mean by grand strategy can become a little bit fuzzy after long periods of time. The other peculiar thing that happens is that people can misremember what actually happened in the war, right? That they can tell themselves myths about why they won or why they lost in ways that have really pernicious impact on their grand strategy. So, Steve, you asked for me to say something about Ukraine, right? I'm always a little bit shy about speaking about an ongoing story, right? But I would say here's one thing to watch for. Right now, the mood, if you read the paper, if you watch the TV, is that Putin is winning. Right? For a long time, it seemed like Putin was losing, but boy, events seems to have changed in the last few months. Right? It seems like he's on the verge of getting everything he wants, or a lot of what he wants. So maybe his strategy is successful. The thing I'll say about that is that Russia has suffered enormously in this war. Russia has paid an enormous, shocking amount in terms of national blood and treasure in this campaign against Ukraine. We don't know how many they've lost, how many have been killed in the war. well into the six figures, right? I think the war has also had tremendous economic effects on Russia as well, which will take a long time to recover from, right? So even if Russia achieves something in terms of taking territory from Ukraine, the price has been gigantic, right? That's my immediate reaction. But I wonder if over the years, the view from the Kremlin will be different. That the view will be that they forgot all that they paid for that triumph. That those costs have become sort of diffuse over time, and that Russia will look back on the war as a great strategic success and start making myths about why it was such a success. That could have long-term implications for how it thinks about fighting the next war.
Great, thanks, Josh. We have the first question on the left side here, and if I might ask, when you ask a question, if you could please give us your name and affiliation if you have one. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I look forward to reading the book, and I'm sorry I haven't had the chance to do it yet. My name is Deborah Decker. I'm with the Stimson Center. And I want to follow on the question that you posed, because I work in the private sector, well, I had until joining Stimson Center, working on strategy. And obviously, strategy is a bigger concept than grand strategy, but I also had worked in government in the Obama administration. And in his national security strategy, he talked about shooting ourselves in the foot. And if you look at all the national security strategies, he was one of the ones who emphasized where do you spend your money? You know, we don't have educated children. And so, but we're spending more on nuclear weapons. And so I wanted to ask you about the U.S. nuclear weapons and how that adds to grand strategy, especially in the age now when we were competing in a whole different area. I worked on nuclear forensics and attribution, and I'm now working in cyber and AI in that area. And I see the parallels there, and we don't have, we're spending more money in the nuclear space when the National Academy of Sciences had posed some, there was a study on risk there. So grand strategy, nuclear weapons, how do we spend our money?
It's great to see you, Deborah. This is a hard one again, because the mood is shifting around nuclear weapons, right? I could give you a very coherent answer to that question 6 months ago, right? Things are a little bit up in the air now. I will say that President Trump has apparently made nuclear weapons a priority, right? So clearly there is thinking within the current administration that nuclear weapons are important, even if maybe other parts of the DoD are not important. It's pledging to cut a lot of resources from DoD, but not nuclear weapons, right? Interestingly, that's consistent. There's been the Obama administration famously begun a nuclear modernization effort while it was simultaneously trying to engage in arms control. We saw that expanded in other administrations as well. And one of the things that I wrestle with in the book is why, right? Because there's a long history of presidents going all the way back to Truman who look at nuclear weapons, and at the critical juncture, they just can't imagine actually using them. They blanch. Like there's something, I call it a special fear of nuclear weapons, right? And you also see this on the Soviet side. Soviet premiers, one after the other, they get presented with war plans and estimates of casualties afterwards, and they get physically sick, right? This happened with Khrushchev. This happened with Brezhnev. It's kind of remarkable. And yet the puzzle is, why do we keep not only building nuclear weapons, but expanding them, the variety of nuclear weapons, the sheer number of them as well? And in the Cold War, there were answers to that question. A lot of the answers had to do with alliance relationships, right? That the United States was really committed to trying to limit the proliferation of nuclear weapons, did not want most of our allies to have them, right? But the U.S. had to develop a sophisticated arsenal with a mix of very powerful and less powerful weapons, and it had to try to convince its allies that it could use them in a war that wouldn't leave Europe, a giant irradiated ruin, right? So American leaders crafted ideas about how they could use their nuclear arsenal as a way of convincing allies not to get their own nuclear weapons, right? I think what's going on currently in terms, or I suspect there are discussions along these lines, has a lot to do with what's called optimal instability. And you know the term, but very briefly, there is in the nuclear strategy world, there's kind of two extremes, right? A world which is completely unstable would give nuclear powers incentives to shoot first. This would be a very dangerous world, right? If the US, China, or Russia thought that they were in deep, deep trouble if they didn't shoot first, that would be unstable because you would have a high chance of a nuclear exchange. But on the other end, right, a world of perfect nuclear stability would be one in which nobody ever thought the other would ever shoot a nuclear weapon at them under any circumstances. Nuclear deterrence is absolutely ironclad, right? It will never happen. Therefore, we have the freedom to fight each other at lower levels because we are not afraid of escalation, right? This is sometimes called the stability-instability paradox. And I suspect there are conversations these days in the NSC and the Pentagon that suggest that this is exactly the problem which encouraged Putin to invade Ukraine. He was sure that the United States wanted nuclear weapons off the table and would not get engaged. So he felt confident that he could fight at a conventional level, right, safely, or without inviting a direct U.S. response. He might have been right. So if you are a U.S. grand strategist, if you want to discourage your adversaries from believing that they have a nuclear shield, what can you do? How do you convince Putin that this won't work again? How do you convince Xi Jinping that there is no such thing as a nuclear shield? Well, one possibility is you want to make the nuclear balance a little less stable than it was before. That is, developing the kind of weapons which might plausibly challenge adversaries' nuclear forces themselves or their command and control hubs, right? And the idea is that you plant just enough of a seed of doubt in their minds so that they don't feel overconfident that no war will ever escalate to the nuclear level or that their nuclear forces will be secure forever and ever and always. If you can achieve this kind of Goldilocks solution, you'll have reached something like optimal instability. But to do that, you need to have a range of forces, right? And you need to be able to convince your adversaries that they might actually be used in such a way. So that's a guess. But I think that might explain the sort of puzzle that you raise.
Hi, thanks for great discussion. And I'm in the middle of the book and I'm so enjoying it. So thank you very much. I'd like to ask you how you think the leaders in China look at the relationship between strategy and grand strategy, and what do we know about that? And are there insights from this book and this research that you think might be of potential interest to and influence in the decisions that go on both in Beijing, but particularly like at the summer retreat in Beijing?
Thank you for the words about the book. And that's perhaps the most important question for U.S. national security for the next several decades is how do Chinese strategists think about these? How do Chinese leaders think about these questions? I'm not a China specialist, so take everything I say about this with a grain of salt. I do write about U.S.-China interaction in the book a little bit. I think that a couple of things are fairly clear about how China thinks about strategy. That is, their theory of victory in a potential war. After the first Gulf War, it's clear that China was impressed. Chinese observers were very impressed with how the US-led coalition fought in 1991. Right? The use of very accurate, very precise munitions, the ability to link forces together through modern communications technologies, the ability to triumph at relatively low cost and very quickly, right, by having information advantages over the other side. And China has spent a great deal of time and effort in the preceding 3.5 decades trying to mimic that, trying to develop technologies, organizational routines, and doctrine which can make that a reality. So if you read open source Chinese doctrine, you see a lot of this. A lot of the idea that the way to win a war is to try to copy what the US did in 1991. You lead the war with attacks on the adversary's intelligence and command and control. You try to blind them quickly. Right? You try to dominate the information space. You confuse your adversary with quick strikes. You seize the initiative, and then you control the pace of combat thereafter. Right? The question that I pose in the book, and that I hope is being discussed in Beijing at the retreat, is whether or not this is really possible, or whether or not this is a kind of technologically driven fantasy about how war with a strong, sophisticated, great power adversary would actually play out, right? It's one thing for the United States to go to war against Iraq in 1991. That is an Iraq which was really a shell of its former self after fighting such a long and disastrous war with Iran in the 1980s. Right? It was such a lopsided engagement. It'd be very different to go up against the United States. Right? And so what worked in the first war might not work. And again, the technologies that you need to use to execute such a strategy, they might look very good on a whiteboard, and they might look very good in a statement of doctrine about seizing the initiative and dominating the information space. But war is not like that. War is the realm of contingency and chance and friction and fog and things not working. Right? So I wonder to what extent Chinese officials really believe the doctrine that they publish, or whether they are aware of the organizational and technological hurdles of making that doctrine a reality. That's a big question that I don't know the answer to. I hope that they have become more cautious and a little more sober over time about their strategy. In terms of China's grand strategy, that's a subject which is much bigger. Clearly, China has a vision of its grand strategy, which involves expanding its influence, of both diplomatic and economic influence, building a stronger military, right, both to secure its borders and to secure what it sees as its local waterways, but also as a coercive tool as well. And the question I would ask about China's grand strategy, again as a non-specialist, is to what extent Chinese leaders distinguish Chinese security, that is territorial integrity and sovereignty, versus regime security. To what extent do Chinese leaders think of national security in terms of the whole nation versus preservation of the Communist Party? And again, I think that will tell you a lot about how they act going forward.
Question from Iskander back left.
Thank you very much, Skander Raymond from RAND. I absolutely love the book. I think it's destined to become a modern classic, and I only wish that all political scientists wrote in such clear and jargon-free prose. So my question to you, Josh, is how did you go about choosing these case studies? And if there was an extended director's cut edition of the book, are there any additional case studies that you would have loved to have included if you had the time and space?
Thank you very much, and I can't repay the compliment. That was overly generous, but I will say that in the roster of people who've written phenomenal Adelphi books, Skander Raymond's book on planning for protraction, where he deals, well, you can do it again. He deals with what a U.S.-China war might look like and the questions we should be thinking about it. One of the things that frustrates me historically is the number of times that countries get into war assuming it will be quick, and then it doesn't go quick, and then they have to scramble and think, well, how do we fight a long war now? Right? We've seen one in recent years. This is very phenomenon happening. So I love the fact that people like Iskander are writing about this and forcing the question in advance, which is great. Extended cut. Well, one thing, you're not going to like the answer. So one thing that I would like to include as a shout out to my political science friends is I am actually interested in the theoretical questions a little bit more. Right? If you read the book, I deliberately keep the theory brief because the history is fascinating, and I think they illustrate so much. But I have another sort of chapter in my mind on theory, right? And forgive me, I am a political science. This is these are my people, and so the director's cut would have a bit more of that as well. In terms of other case studies that I think would be potentially very useful, one that comes to mind immediately is the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 and 1905, which I find such a fascinating war for so many different levels. You have a rising Japan and a declining imperial Russia. You have two nations with very different perceptions of one another. You have two nations trying to use, at the time, very new technologies, both on land and on the sea, right? And you have a very dramatic outcome with far-reaching effects on grand strategy for both sides. So if I had to, there's so many interesting case studies, but if I had one to look more at, I would love to dig into that case. I should also say for the professors in the room, it's a great teaching case because very few people know anything about it. And there's no baggage, and people are willing to, pretend you are on the Russian side, pretend you are on the Japanese side. How would you think through these problems? So that's a candidate for the extended.
Another question just behind Iskander.
Matt Butler, U.S. Air Force. Lots of whiteboards, lots of doctrine. Another thank you for the readability. I think everybody is praising that. So my question then goes to, I guess this is director's cut. Does defining strategy as your theory of victory, are you limiting strategy to operational campaign planning? And if it's not if it is not limited, how do you reconcile a strategic definition of theory of victory with the never-ending competition for relative strategic advantage?
Great. It's a fabulous question. A theory of victory is not restricted to campaign planning. Campaign planning is very important, of course, right? And how you actually execute in war is very important. But victory is not executing a well managed campaign. Victory is compelling the enemy to do your will, right? In some cases, victory means demolishing the enemy in unlimited wars where you feel that the enemy is basically incorrigible and beyond being influenced and just needs to go. But in the vast majority of cases, victory means achieving a political settlement, right? And war is a political act. So it's not enough to organize effective campaigns. They need to be tied to some political result. And this is why strategy is both interesting and so bloody hard, right? So difficult to do this. Because if you think about the problem in those terms, right, I am trying to use something which is inherently destructive, right, to build something politically constructive. I need to smash my enemy. I need to use violence against my enemy, but then convince him to do what I want and trust that I will follow through on my promises after smashing him violently. I need to use an instrument of state power which provokes such intense emotions, such rage, such desire for revenge. But at the end of that, I need to then step back and translate that into some rational bargain that leads to a durable outcome, right? You are 100% correct that it's not enough to do that in a campaign plan. That's only the first step. But the next step is just extremely important in the context of war. The similarity with grand strategy is that maintaining security also involves this process of building effective bureaucracies, like the Department of Defense or the intelligence community or the State Department, building them, staffing them, equipping them, showing the world that you have the means to defend yourself, right? But at the same time, talking with the world and assuring the rest of the world that you don't mean to use those capabilities to do them harm, right? And again, this can be awfully difficult because capabilities that we see as inherently defensive and just for the preservation of our own national interest and national security, they might view as threatening or dangerous, right? So in grand strategy, it's not enough to build the capabilities without the diplomacy that you attach to that to make it stable and lasting. Just like in war, it's not enough to write the campaign plan without thinking of the diplomatic and political endgame.
Thanks. I was just wondering, bearing in mind, Corey, that you and David spent some time together on the policy planning staff at the Department of State, if you and perhaps also Stephen could perhaps reflect on your time in government. You know, that's a different perspective than we've discussed really so far. But thinking about strategy and grand strategy when you were in government, what are the particular challenges to having a long-term, coherent view of these issues day to day?
So one challenge is that the world, your adversaries are always working to undercut your strategy, and the world's not compliant by producing events that throw you off key. But that's why grand strategy matters so much, because it gives you a star to navigate by, and it also helps you understand how much to pay for what you are trying to achieve, which I think is always the hardest question in grand strategy. What opportunities do you take? What opportunities do you let pass by? I'd be willing to bet that most American presidents wish we had let the Vietnam experience pass us by, because it looks like we paid a lot too much for what we were getting. I think most American historians will look at the Iraq and possibly even the Afghan wars that way. But at the points of decision, almost all of these questions of implementation are a 51 to 49 trade-off. It's a lot clearer in theory. And when I was reading the nuclear chapter, Josh, of your book, I was thinking, well, of course they didn't follow through on a clear, crystalline employment of their strategy. They wanted a big, wide margin of error in case their theory didn't work. And that's why you get so much continuity, because if a grand strategy appears to be working, it makes it very sticky, because alternative theories might not prove as successfully implementable.
Yeah, I would sort of highlight two aspects within my government service that I think mitigate against thinking in grand strategic terms, which is unfortunate. I think one of them is just the fact of the day-to-day crisis that envelops all of your work, particularly, I'm thinking to my last job in the State Department, where it was impossible to think beyond, I was working on democracy and human rights issues and security abuse issues in sub-Saharan Africa. And it was impossible to even sort of take a step back and sort of say, well, what trends are we seeing and how does that relate to our own theory of security, as opposed to just sort of saying we need to push this leader more, or we need to figure out this military leader's interventions here. And it was just sort of like playing a game of whack-a-mole constantly that never ended. And so, there are certain units, policy planning, certain parts of the NSC that work on strategic planning that have the ability at moments to take a step back and do that a little more. But even then, it's more on a 4-year time horizon at best, given kind of political terms and so forth. The other thing that kind of comes to my mind is that there really is a difficulty in sort of extricating yourself from path dependency. That the easiest thing to do is to keep going along with the status quo, whether it's in an ongoing, enduring war in Afghanistan or Iraq, as opposed to kind of bucking a trend and pushing back and making hard choices that don't have immediate political payoffs. And we've seen the political price that Biden paid when it came to withdrawing from Afghanistan or other sort of prior wars. And so I think that getting yourself to within the bureaucracy to remove from that path dependent thinking is hard.
I can't resist the temptation to say that the Biden administration's end of the Afghan war is a perfect illustration of the way your strategy can demolish your grand strategy by being poorly executed.
Just these are. I'm thinking a lot about your comment about inertia, and Steve, you mentioned path dependence, and earlier you asked a tremendous question, Steve, which I shamefully did not answer, which was what causes grand strategy to change? Fabulous question, right? I don't answer that in the book. I kind of, shame on me, the director's cut, it'll be there. So, but this does matter. And obviously this is something that we're all wrestling with right now. Like, people are using the phrase tectonic shifts in American national security strategy right now. So we should deal with this rather than dodge the question like I did. So what causes grand strategy to change? First thing to say is I don't know. I have 2 ideas, one based on the work in the book and one based on sort of my broader read of U.S. history over the last half century or longer. The one based on the book is that a shocking military defeat sometimes jogs the state into reconsidering its grand strategy. This did seem to be the thing that happened in Great Britain after the American War of Independence, right? There was a lot going on in London in the 1770s and 1780s. They were dealing with economic distress. There were lots of fights in Parliament. There were a lot of questions about whether they should go all in into their naval modernization scheme or whether they should hold on to the 13 colonies. Losing big and decisively and embarrassingly actually forced a hard conversation. So that might be one origin of grand strategic change. The other one has to do with domestic politics, right? And this gets us up to the present day issues that we're dealing with in the United States. My read on American politics is, well, pretty pessimistic. And the problem that I see is that American public faith in institutions has been declining since the 1960s. You can look at Gallup polling data over time. They ask the same question over and over again. How much do you believe in this institution or that institution or the other? And there's just this long-term decline, right? So that you get to a moment where there's this sort of general both a little bit of political apathy, but also just loss of faith in the government itself. And that's an environment in which somebody can come in and exploit that sentiment, right? Somebody can take advantage of that sentiment and say, well, you don't like the institutions, well, I'm going to radically change them. And in so doing, I'm going to implement my view of grand strategy, right? So again, these are half-formed thoughts because events are moving quickly. But this is something I have noticed over the years, is this long-term loss of faith in institutions might lead to a culminating point, and we might be living in it right now.
Thanks. We have one question from Ed Ift in the front.
Since you mentioned in the introduction that you worked with Edward Lozansky, American University in Moscow, And in the introduction, it was mentioned that you work for USAID. No? You. Okay, so question to you then. What's your opinion of USAID, and whether you think that what Elon Musk and Donald Trump are saying is correct, or maybe it's just you have different opinion?
If we can just package that with one more question from Ed.
Thank you, Edward F. Stanford University. I'm wondering whether you have any thoughts on the importance of understanding other people's grand strategy. I mean, just two obvious examples, US attacking Iraq, Russia attacking Ukraine. In both cases, the assumptions of the attacking country were catastrophically wrong. Well, why is this so difficult, and what could be done to fix this situation?
I'll take that question. Maybe you can speak to USAID. I know you can. I agree with you utterly that understanding the perception of rival states is essential. This is empathy. And by empathy, I don't mean sympathy. I don't mean hugging your adversary. I mean a serious attempt to understand what's motivating their actions, right? And too often in the run-up to conflict, not just in the United States, but in other countries historically, it's easier just to make simple, facile assumptions about what's driving an adversary, right? Sometimes these assumptions are terrible. They're racist. They just attribute the worst characteristics to their adversary without actually taking them seriously. And there are reasons why this happens historically. There's a human tendency to kind of demonize the adversary and to motivate yourself to go fight. But it's terrible and tragic, and it's a pathway to strategic disaster to do this. So how do you avoid doing it? Well, I can't fix that problem, but one thing that I would suggest is reinvest in your intelligence community, okay? But also, more importantly, you have to take seriously the problem of intelligence policy relations. That is, how do you create an environment in which an intelligence chief can go to a president and say, I'm going to tell you things that you might not want to hear about the adversary. I'm going to tell you things about the adversary which are not what you've been saying publicly, right? But it's important for you to understand. Having those kind of conversations behind closed doors, outside of the public view, is absolutely essential for cultivating this idea of empathy, right? But it's really hard to do. And there are reasons, again, why intelligence policy relations are difficult. But again, this is something that we should be investing in, we should be talking about, and we should be trying to work on.
One thing, in my experience in government, it wasn't in any of the wars across the 20 years or so I was in government. There was never one theory of the case of what is our enemy trying to do. It's a scramble of, is it this or is it that or is it this? And it's actually incredibly hard to do. It's much easier to do when you are looking back at it than when you're trying to figure out on the basis of imperfect intelligence in real time when there are real consequences for being wrong. And in my experience, in 91, in the Balkan Wars, in 2001, and in 2005, that there were competing theories of the case, and it wasn't clear who was right.
Just really quickly, the other thing I would recommend is have Corey on your NSC staff. No, she's fabulous at encouraging these kinds of really hard conversations, right? And people who radically disagree, they can all get together and think about these with somebody like Corey in the room. And I'm not just saying this because I'm a big fan of your work. I'm saying that we need more people like this to go into government, right? We need really smart people who are willing to try to see issues from multiple perspectives, to take that skill and that instinct and to choose service, right? Rather than going and making a lot of money in Silicon Valley or Wall Street or wherever, right? And again, just I don't mean to be on a pedestal here, but rebuilding faith in institutions and rebuilding sort of a public ethos is going to be important.
Yeah. So if I'm sorry to cut us off, but in true IISS style, I'm going to end us right on time because I know, Steve, you have the flexibility to connect offline for a minute or two on the aid question, which is great. But I wanted to give Joshua the last word. I think you've given us a really masterful tour d'horizon of the concepts that you've sketched out of strategy and grant strategy. Corey, Stephen, your insights have lifted up Joshua's analysis even further. So thank you very much for participating. Again, I would encourage everyone to get a hold of a copy of Joshua's book. It really is. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you for joining us at the IISS Washington. Thanks. Let's give them all a round of applause.